Every morning, as the first rays of light filtered through the curtains, I would slowly open my eyes and find myself lying next to Michael, the man who had been my partner for years, the father of our children, the one who had promised to love me forever. His steady breath, deep and rhythmic, seemed to ground the world around me, as if everything in life would continue with its usual precision. But it was in those moments, lying next to him, that I would feel the quiet stirrings of something inside me, a restless ache, a yearning that neither the passing of time nor the mundane routine of our shared life seemed capable of soothing. Michael was a good man, deeply invested in his work and in the structure of our life together. He was diligent, dependable, and always focused on his business pursuits. His dedication to our family's financial security was unshakable, and I had long learned to appreciate the stability he provided. Yet, in that stability, I began to feel a sense of suffocation, a deep, gnawing sensation that something vital was missing, something essential that I couldn't quite name. It was not that I was unhappy in the traditional sense. Our house was full, our children were growing up, and life seemed to be unfolding as it should. But something inside me felt hollow, as though the core of who I was had been quietly eroded by the relentless passage of time, by the quiet rhythms of daily life that no longer filled me with the same joy they once had. At first, I couldn't quite place the source of this emptiness. It wasn't boredom, though I had tried to convince myself that it was. I had everything I needed, or so I thought: good health, a comfortable home, a loving husband. But the more I examined my feelings, the clearer it became I was yearning for something more. Something beyond the role of wife, mother, and caretaker. There was a craving within me for passion, for excitement, for the thrill of something uncharted and untamed, something that would break the monotony of our carefully crafted life. As Michael poured his energy into his work, often returning home late or spending entire weekends away on business trips, I found myself caught in the stillness of our home. It wasn't that I didn't love him, nor that I didn't appreciate the life we had built together. It was just that the life we shared had become so predictable, so safe, that it no longer felt alive. I would wander through our house, cleaning, organizing, preparing meals, small tasks that filled the day, but left me feeling more distant from my own desires. I found myself going through the motions of life, smiling when expected, laughing at the right moments, but all the while feeling a hollow ache deep in my chest. The worst part was the quiet guilt that accompanied these feelings. I was ashamed of wanting more, ashamed of feeling restless when I had so much to be grateful for. There were times when I would look at Michael, his face softened in sleep, and I would feel a deep sorrow for what I had become. The woman who had once been filled with dreams and excitement now seemed a mere shadow of herself, walking through life with eyes that had grown too accustomed to the blur of routine. We had married young, and in the beginning, our love had been so vibrant, so full of possibility. I had felt that there was no limit to the dreams we could share, no adventure too big for us to embark on together. But somewhere along the way, the dream had changed. Michael had become absorbed in his work, and I had settled into the role of wife and mother. At first, I had embraced it, finding fulfillment in nurturing our children and supporting Michael. But gradually, as the years wore on, I began to wonder if there was more to life than this, if there was more to me than the woman I had become in the shadows of Michael's ambition. The emptiness was not just about our marriage. It was about me, who I was, who I had once been, and the person I could no longer seem to access. I had traded my youthful zest for life for security and comfort, but in doing so, I had lost something precious: my own sense of self. There was a version of me somewhere deep inside that longed to be seen, longed to feel something other than the quiet satisfaction of daily chores and responsibilities. I didn't know how to voice these desires, how to articulate what I was feeling, so I kept them hidden, buried beneath the surface of my ordinary life. Every evening when Michael would come home, tired and preoccupied, I would smile and greet him with a kiss. We would talk about the children, the household, and his work, but in those moments I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There was a distance between us, a gap that I couldn't close with polite conversation or simple affection. I wanted to reach out, to tell him how I felt, but the words never came. And so I retreated further into myself, allowing the silence between us to grow. I began to believe that I was destined to be nothing more than a caretaker, someone who existed to keep the wheels of family life turning while Michael pursued his career. The thought saddened me, but there was a strange comfort in it as well. It was easier to keep my thoughts to myself, to pretend that everything was fine, than to confront the truth that I didn't know who I was anymore. My longing for something more began to take root in small, subtle ways. I would find myself daydreaming about the past, about the time before marriage and children, when I had been free to chase my own dreams, when life had seemed wide open with possibility. I would fantasize about escaping the confines of my life, even if just for a short while, and rediscovering the person I had once been. But those thoughts were fleeting, and I quickly dismissed them as selfish or unrealistic. After all, who was I to want more when I had everything I could need? But as the days passed, the sense of dissatisfaction grew stronger. It wasn't just a passing thought, it was a deep, gnawing need that seemed to penetrate every aspect of my life. It was no longer enough to simply carry on. I wanted to feel something real, something that could stir me from my slumber. And yet, I didn't know where to turn or how to begin this journey of self-discovery. I was trapped in a life I had built, a life that, while comfortable and secure, felt increasingly like a prison. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room watching the children play, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman who stared back at me seemed unfamiliar, as if she had become a stranger in her own life. Her eyes were dull, her smile tight and forced, and there was a heaviness in her posture that spoke of years of unspoken desires and unacknowledged needs. I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could go on pretending that everything was fine. How much longer could I ignore the growing restlessness inside me before it shattered everything? That was the moment I realized that something had to change. I couldn't continue living like this, trapped in a life that no longer fulfilled me. But what was I to do? How could I escape the confines of my own making? I knew I was at a crossroads, but the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. What would it take for me to rediscover myself, to find the woman I had lost somewhere along the way? And could I ever be truly happy again if I stayed in this life, forever pretending that I was content? In the weeks that followed, the emptiness within me only deepened. I began to look at Michael with a mixture of affection and sorrow, unable to shake the feeling that he had become a stranger to me as well. We were both living in a world that no longer felt real, but we were too afraid to admit it. And in my heart, I knew that the longer I stayed in this half-life, the more I risked losing everything I once held dear. The yearning inside me had become something I could no longer ignore, something that would eventually demand attention whether I was ready for it or not. And so I carried on. But deep within me, a quiet voice began to whisper that it was only a matter of time before everything I had built would unravel. I had begun to question not just my marriage, but my entire life. And that realization, perhaps more than anything else, was what terrified me most. The day I first walked into the veterinary clinic, I had no idea it would be the start of a journey that would unravel everything in my life. It began as an ordinary trip, nothing more than a routine errand to take our cat, Whiskers, in for her vaccination. It was supposed to be simple, a quick stop on my way to run other mundane errands that seemed to fill my days like clockwork. The smell of antiseptic, the soft murmur of voices in the waiting room, and the distant sound of animals shifting in their cages were familiar. It was a world I had entered countless times before, nothing out of the ordinary. But that afternoon, the very air in the clinic seemed to shift in a way I couldn't explain. As I stepped into the cool, sterile space, my eyes adjusted to the dim lighting that contrasted with the bright, sunlit world outside. The scent of medicine and disinfectant was heavy in the air, yet there was something else, a faint undercurrent of hay and animal musk that reminded me of the barn behind the clinic. It was an odd mixture of clean and earthy, the kind of smell you might associate with a stable, where the world of nature met that of human care. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights buzzed in the background, but I was distracted by something else, something unexpected. As I walked up to the front desk, I found myself glancing toward the back of the clinic, where the horses and donkeys were kept. It wasn't just the animals that caught my eye, it was the man standing there, moving between the stalls. Dr. Samuel had been a name that had occasionally drifted through my mind during my previous visits. I had seen him before, of course, though our encounters had been brief and impersonal. He was the head veterinarian, the man in charge of the clinic, but there had never been any reason to engage with him beyond the cursory pleasantries of a professional exchange. However, on this particular day, as I watched him from across the room, something stirred in me. There was a quiet confidence about him, a way of moving through the space that seemed both graceful and deliberate. His dark hair, slightly tousled from the workday, framed his face in a way that was almost effortless. His eyes, striking in their depths, seemed to glimmer with a warmth that was rare, especially in such a professional setting, and his smile, when he finally turned toward me, caught me off guard. It was soft but direct, as if he could see past the surface and into something deeper, something that I was only just beginning to recognize in myself. "Hello, Mrs. Stone," he said, his voice low and smooth, almost like a melody. "Whiskers, I presume. How's she doing today?" His words seemed ordinary enough, but they carried an undertone that resonated with me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I nodded, suddenly aware of how flustered I felt, though I couldn't quite place why. There was a kind of warmth in the way he looked at me, something inviting and disarming. I had never been one to pay much attention to physical attraction, at least not since marrying Michael, but in that moment, I felt something stir inside me, a small flicker of something that had been dormant for far too long. As we walked together toward the examination room, I felt his presence like a weight beside me, pulling my attention in a way I wasn't used to. The hallways of the clinic seemed to stretch before us, but I couldn't help but notice the way his footsteps echoed in time with mine. There was something magnetic about him, something I couldn't quite define, and it both intrigued and unsettled me. He spoke about the work he did, about the animals in his care, but his words seemed to fade into the background as I found myself watching the movements of his hands, large, capable hands that seemed so natural in the context of his work. His hands were precise, yet there was a tenderness in the way he interacted with the animals, a deep understanding of them that I admired. Dr. Samuel led me into the back room where Whiskers would be examined, his hands brushing against the various medical tools with practiced ease. The examination was routine, and for a moment, I allowed myself to relax, to let the tension of the day dissipate as I focused on the task at hand. But even as I tried to focus on my cat, I couldn't shake the growing sense of awareness that seemed to surround me whenever Dr. Samuel was near. His presence was commanding yet gentle, like a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. I couldn't help but steal glances at him as he moved around the room, his back to me as he prepared Whiskers for her vaccination. There was a kind of grace in his movements, a fluidity that was almost hypnotic. As he turned to face me, catching my gaze for just a split second, the world seemed to still. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a strange tug deep within my chest. It was almost as if he saw something in me, something that had long been buried beneath layers of routine and expectation. "How's your husband, Mrs. Stone?" Dr. Samuel asked, his voice breaking the moment of silence that had enveloped us. His question was innocuous enough, but there was a curiosity behind his tone, something that made me feel as though he was trying to understand more than just the surface details of my life. "Oh, Michael's doing fine," I replied, a smile pulling at my lips. "Busy as always with work." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I imagine it can get a little lonely, huh?" With him always so busy, there was a hint of something almost knowing in the way he spoke. And for a moment I wondered if he could sense the underlying tension in my life. The silence between us grew heavier, and I found myself struggling to maintain eye contact, a sudden awareness of my own vulnerability washing over me. The moment passed, and the routine of the examination continued. But something had shifted in me. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of awareness, but I couldn't deny the stirring feeling within me. Dr. Samuel was not like the other men I knew. There was something about him, something unspoken, that seemed to make everything around me feel more vivid, more alive. I had never been someone who paid much attention to attraction, especially after years of being married to Michael, but in that moment, I could no longer ignore the spark that had been ignited. When the appointment was over, Dr. Samuel offered me a smile as he handed me the vaccination records for Whiskers. "I'll see you again soon," Mrs. Stone, he said, his voice soft but meaningful. I nodded, too overwhelmed to form a coherent response. As I walked out of the clinic, I couldn't help but replay the encounter in my mind. The conversation, his gaze, the subtle pull I had felt in his presence, it was all there, lingering in the back of my mind. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they persisted, like a whispering voice that refused to be silenced. Little did I know that this seemingly insignificant encounter would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and the life I had built. Dr. Samuel had entered my world as quietly as a whisper, but in his presence, everything changed. The longing, the emptiness I had been trying to ignore for so long suddenly felt alive again, and with it came a sense of something dangerous, something thrilling, that I couldn't deny. The clinic, once a place I visited out of necessity, had transformed into something else entirely. It became a realm of possibilities, a place where the ordinary merged with the extraordinary. And in that world, Dr. Samuel was no longer just the veterinarian I had come to know through the occasional checkup for our pets. He had become something more, a symbol of the desires I had long buried, a representation of the unspoken cravings that had begun to surface. As I left the clinic that day, I couldn't help but wonder what would become of these feelings. Would they fade like so many others had before, or was this the beginning of something far more complicated? It started as a flicker of something unexpected, a spark that neither of us had planned nor anticipated, yet once ignited, it quickly grew, consuming every shred of doubt and hesitation I had. Looking back, it felt almost as if I had been waiting for it, though I could never have put words to that feeling before it happened. It wasn't that I had consciously sought this out or even thought about it, much rather, it was as though life had presented me with an opening, and in that moment, I was too weak or too curious to resist stepping through it. It was a chilly evening in early autumn when I first found myself in his presence outside of the sterile walls of the clinic. I had been there earlier that day, bringing in my dog Mabel for her checkup. The vet clinic was a small but modern building, nestled just on the outskirts of town. I had been coming there for months, and Dr. Samuel had always been the professional I relied on. He was a man of few words, but those words were always precise, and they had an underlying warmth that made me feel reassured. His calm demeanor and expert knowledge had gained my trust, and with every visit I found myself drawn to him in ways I didn't fully understand at first. There was something magnetic about the way he carried himself, something quiet and steady that contrasted so sharply with the chaos of my own thoughts and desires. It was a subtle kind of charm, one that didn't demand attention but slowly worked its way under your skin. That evening, I had dropped Mabel off at the clinic for her post-surgery follow-up and decided to wait in the small lobby while Dr. Samuel finished up his consultations. The waiting room was quiet, its white walls adorned with calming pictures of animals in peaceful settings. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, mixed with the comforting scent of wood from the few pieces of furniture scattered throughout the room. It was the kind of place that exuded safety, so safe, in fact, that I almost felt embarrassed for the emotions that seemed to swirl inside me whenever Dr. Samuel would walk by. He wasn't exceptionally handsome by any stretch, nor did he have that overt charisma that one might associate with the start of an affair. But there was an intensity in his eyes, an openness in the way he spoke to me, that made me feel as though we shared a secret, a connection that no one else in the room could sense, and perhaps that was the very allure of it. As I sat there, flipping through a magazine that I couldn't focus on, I heard his footsteps before I saw him. A subtle shift in the air, the faint sound of shoes against the hard tile floor. Dr. Samuel entered the lobby, glancing briefly at me before offering a smile. The kind of smile that seemed both genuine and professional, as though he were accustomed to navigating the delicate space between courtesy and friendship. He made his way toward the front desk to speak with the receptionist, and I watched him with a curiosity that bordered on obsession. His face was impassive, but there was something about the way he moved, something deliberate in his gestures that made me feel as though he were fully aware of my presence, as if he had been waiting for this moment too. But of course he hadn't. It was all in my head, I knew that. But the idea lingered just enough to make me wonder what would happen if I let it grow. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in my thoughts, when he finally turned and walked over to me. The movement was so casual, so unremarkable, yet in that moment, everything about the encounter felt significant. I looked up at him, my breath catching slightly in my throat as he approached. His eyes, warm and unreadable, met mine, and for a moment, I felt as though time had slowed. There was a question in his gaze, an unspoken inquiry that seemed to hang between us like a fragile thread. "I just wanted to check in and see how Mabel is doing after the surgery," he said, his voice steady but somehow more intimate than it had ever been before. It was then that I realized how close he had come, standing just a few feet away, the space between us no longer comfortable but rather charged with an electricity I hadn't expected. "Oh, she's doing well," I replied, trying to sound casual, trying to ignore the sudden flutter in my chest. "She's resting, just a little sore." "That's good to hear," he nodded, his gaze softening. For a second, it felt like we were the only two people in the room, the sounds of the clinic fading into the background. I could feel the air between us shift, thickening, and for the first time in a long while, I found myself questioning my own emotions. I had been feeling so disconnected from everything, from Michael, from my life, and here, in the presence of this man, everything seemed to become clearer. The loneliness, the dissatisfaction, it all began to crystallize into something tangible, something real. And there, right in front of me, was the temptation to break free, to make a choice that would change everything. "Would you like to grab a coffee sometime?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, surprising even myself. I immediately regretted it, but his response was not one of rejection. Instead, he paused, considering the request for only a moment before giving me a soft smile. "I think I'd like that," he said, his voice steady but with a trace of something else, something that suggested he wasn't entirely indifferent to the idea. And that was all it took. That small exchange, that brief moment of vulnerability had planted the seed. We agreed to meet the following week, and though neither of us acknowledged the undercurrent of unspoken tension that hung between us, it was there. The next few days passed in a haze. I found myself replaying our conversation over and over in my head, dissecting every word, every glance. I told myself that it was nothing, just two people talking. But I knew better. It was something more, something I couldn't quite control, and it was already starting to consume me. When the day finally arrived, I told Michael that I was going out for a quick errand. The lie came easily, slipping off my tongue without a second thought. I knew I had no reason to justify my actions, no reason to explain myself. But still, the guilt gnawed at me. I wasn't the type of person who did things like this. I had never cheated, never allowed myself to be caught up in anything illicit. But that night, as I prepared to leave, I felt a surge of adrenaline rush through me. There was something so alluring about the thought of doing something reckless, something that had the potential to shatter the carefully constructed life I had built. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. Alive in a way I had forgotten I could. When I met Dr. Samuel at the small cafe near the clinic, the moment I saw him, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. He was standing outside, waiting for me, his hands in his pockets as he glanced around. His eyes locked onto mine as I approached, and there was a shift in the air, a sense of inevitability, as if everything that had led up to this point had been building toward this one instant. The conversation started slowly, awkwardly, as two people unsure of what to say when everything they felt was left unsaid. But with each passing moment, the tension between us grew, and I found myself leaning in, drawn to him in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was clear that this meeting was not just a casual encounter. We were both aware of what was happening, even if we chose not to acknowledge it out loud. And in that silence, in that unspoken understanding, the affair had already begun. The escalation of the affair was a slow burn that caught me off guard in its intensity. At first, it had been simple, a stolen glance, a fleeting conversation, the quiet thrill of something forbidden. But as the weeks passed, the attraction deepened, transforming into something I could no longer control, something I didn't want to control. I had long stopped questioning why this was happening to me, why I was drawn into this chaotic spiral. It was as though I was slipping down a path, one I had chosen but couldn't find the courage to step off, even as I saw the consequences looming at every turn. The meetings with Dr. Samuel became more frequent. What had begun as occasional coffee dates turned into private encounters in the back rooms of the clinic. We started finding excuses to meet more often, and the lies I told to Michael, those small, seemingly innocent fabrications, became easier to weave. I told him I was volunteering at the clinic, helping out with the animals, spending extra hours assisting with the horses and donkeys. Michael believed me, or at least I convinced myself that he did. He was caught up in his own world, his business taking more and more of his time. The space between us had grown so wide that the lies, though shameful, didn't feel like a betrayal at the time. It felt like a secret, something that belonged to me and to Dr. Samuel, something thrilling and intoxicating that was just between us. It wasn't just the clandestine nature of our meetings that deepened my sense of desire, but the quiet moments with him when we were alone, away from the constraints of the clinic's sterile, professional atmosphere. He was kind to me, attentive in ways that I had longed for but never received from Michael. There was an intensity in the way Dr. Samuel spoke, as though every word had meaning, every gesture was deliberate. His hands, when they brushed against mine, sent jolts of electricity through me, and the slow burn of anticipation between us began to feel like something I could no longer ignore. But it was the involvement with the animals that truly complicated everything. At first, I thought I was there simply to assist Dr. Samuel, to lend a hand in the clinic's various duties. I told myself it was just part of my growing attraction to him, a way to spend more time together in a setting where no one would suspect anything out of the ordinary. But as I spent more time at the clinic, as I helped with the horses and donkeys, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the connection I felt with Dr. Samuel anymore. It wasn't just the way he looked at me with that strange mix of curiosity and longing. It became about the animals. I found myself drawn to them in a way I couldn't explain. Something primal, something deep within me that had been hidden for so long began to emerge. The line between my growing desire for Dr. Samuel and my newfound fascination with the horses and donkeys blurred, and I started to question my own sanity. The animals were magnificent creatures, majestic horses with muscular frames, their coats gleaming in the sunlight, the sound of their hooves striking the earth like a steady rhythm. The donkeys, with their soft, pleading eyes, their docile nature, seemed to offer a kind of comfort that I hadn't realized I needed. And it was in the stillness of the barn, surrounded by their presence, that I began to feel something shift within me. It wasn't just their beauty, their grace that captivated me. It was the raw power they embodied, the untamed energy that seemed to pulse through them, something wild and freeing that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. Dr. Samuel was always nearby, guiding me through the daily chores, showing me how to care for the animals with a tenderness that made my heart ache. His hands, so capable and gentle with the creatures, became a source of fascination for me. He would stroke the horses' necks, his fingers lightly tracing their outlines as he whispered soothing words to them. And it wasn't just the animals who responded to his touch, it was me. Every time he brushed past me, every time his hand grazed my arm, I felt a surge of something darker, something I wasn't ready to confront. One afternoon, as we worked together in the barn, cleaning out the stalls, Dr. Samuel took me aside. The clinic had quieted down, and there was a strange, almost eerie stillness in the air. The horses were resting in their stalls, their eyes half-lidded as the sun filtered through the cracks in the barn, casting long shadows across the floor. He was standing close to me now, his presence overwhelming, and I could feel my pulse quicken. There was something in the air between us, something unspoken, something urgent. "I think you should get closer to them," he said quietly, nodding toward the horses. "There's a bond you need to understand if you're going to work with them. It's more than just caring for them. It's about trust, about connection. They can feel what we feel." I didn't question his words, didn't stop to think about the implications of what he was suggesting. Instead, I nodded and followed him as he led me to Thunder, a massive black stallion that stood proudly in his stall, his coat gleaming with muscle. Dr. Samuel guided me toward the horse, his voice low and soothing as he spoke to the animal, his fingers gently stroking Thunder's mane. As I stood there watching him, I felt an odd stirring within me. I wasn't sure what it was, whether it was the way the animal responded to Dr. Samuel's touch, or the way his fingers moved so confidently over the horse's body. The sensation was subtle at first, a quiet hum of awareness, but as I stood there, I felt something begin to shift. My breath caught in my throat, and I realized that I was no longer focused on the animal in front of me. Instead, I was focused on Dr. Samuel, on the way his hand moved over the horse's coat, on the tension in his body as he gently guided the creature. The moment was electric. The barn, once quiet and peaceful, suddenly seemed charged with something darker, something dangerous. I wasn't sure what had changed, but I could feel it, a pull, a force that had me in its grasp, and I didn't know how to break free. Dr. Samuel turned to me then, his eyes locking onto mine with a look that sent a shiver down my spine. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unspoken, that made my heart race. "Touch him," he said, his voice low and almost seductive. "Feel the bond. Feel what I feel." I hesitated, but only for a moment. I stepped closer to the horse, my fingers brushing lightly against Thunder's coat. The horse's skin was warm under my touch, and I could feel his muscles ripple beneath the surface. But as my fingers grazed the animal's body, I became aware of Dr. Samuel's presence behind me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand brushed mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. I felt the warmth of his touch, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow, to shrink down to just the two of us, caught in something neither of us had fully anticipated. And then it happened. The line between animal and man, between forbidden desire and uncontrollable impulse, blurred. It wasn't something I could explain, nor could I justify it. It was a moment that felt inevitable, as though the universe had conspired to bring us here, to this point. The boundary between the physical world and the emotional one seemed to dissolve, and I found myself caught between what I wanted and what I feared. The sensation was overwhelming, and I couldn't stop it, nor did I want to. I remember Dr. Samuel's voice, soft and coaxing, as he whispered words of encouragement, guiding me in ways I had never imagined. The world around me felt like it was closing in, and I realized, in that moment, that I was lost to the allure of the forbidden, to the thrill of the unknown. And what had begun as a simple affair, a brief escape from the life I had built, was now something more, a spiral I couldn't stop, a path I was already too far down to turn back from. The discovery was not dramatic, not the kind that comes with a loud bang or a confrontation that leaves one's world shattered in an instant. It was more like a slow, creeping awareness, a quiet realization that wrapped itself around my mind, tightening with every passing moment until it was all I could think about. Michael's suspicion had been there for a while, I think, lingering beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. The signs had been small little things that, to anyone else, might have seemed insignificant. The extra hours at the clinic, the subtle changes in my behavior, the way I began to distance myself emotionally, even when I was physically present. But Michael wasn't just anyone. He knew me too well. I had tried to keep my affair with Dr. Samuel hidden, of course, as anyone would. At first, it had been a whirlwind, exciting, forbidden, and intoxicating. But as time went on, the thrill began to fade, and the guilt crept in. I tried to convince myself that what I was doing wasn't hurting anyone. Michael was busy with work, we were both in a rut, going through the motions of daily life. It had been so long since I'd felt truly alive. Dr. Samuel had offered something I couldn't resist, a new kind of excitement, a departure from the mundane. But the lie I had been living became more difficult to sustain. The little lies, the casual excuses I made, began to pile up, and eventually they became too heavy to bear. It was on a cool afternoon in early spring when everything came crashing down. I had just finished my shift at the clinic, and as usual, I planned to visit Dr. Samuel before heading home. I wasn't even thinking about what I was doing anymore. It had become routine, a part of my life I couldn't imagine ending, even though I knew, deep down, that I had crossed a line I could never undo. The thought of Michael finding out had crossed my mind 100 times, but I always dismissed it. I convinced myself that I was careful, that I had everything under control. But in truth, I was living in a house of cards, and all it would take was one gust of wind to bring it all down. As I drove toward the clinic, I noticed something unusual. The air was thick with a sense of unease, the kind you feel when you're being watched but can't quite pinpoint the source of your discomfort. I didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to the anxiety that had been building inside me for days. But then, as I turned the corner to the clinic, I saw him. Michael. He was standing by the horse stalls, looking at something intently, his posture stiff and rigid. I slowed the car, my heart leaping in my chest. There was no mistaking it, he had come here, to the one place I thought was my sanctuary, my secret. My world tilted, and for the first time I felt a true sense of panic. I parked the car, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. I told myself I could explain, that I could lie my way out of this, but deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The truth was already hanging in the air, and no amount of words could erase it. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cold breeze biting at my skin as I walked toward the barn. Every step felt like an eternity. As I drew closer, I saw Michael's face clearly now, his expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. His eyes flicked toward me, And then, to my horror, they landed on Dr. Samuel, who was standing just a few feet away, his back to me as he worked with one of the horses. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Michael's eyes locked onto mine, and the moment of recognition was swift and brutal. There was no need for words. The look on his face said everything. He had seen enough. His gaze flickered between Dr. Samuel and me, and in that moment I realized that I had been caught. My body went cold, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, as though it were trying to escape. I had no idea how much he knew or how long he had been watching, but I didn't need to. The silence between us was thick, suffocating, and in that silence, the weight of my actions hit me like a freight train. "What is this?" Michael's voice was low, trembling with anger. His gaze shifted between me and Dr. Samuel, and I could see the confusion in his eyes, mingled with something far darker. Betrayal. A sense of being completely blindsided. He wasn't angry yet, no, not yet, but I knew that was coming. His words hung in the air, hanging over me like a death sentence, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the reality of what I had done. Before I could respond, Dr. Samuel turned around, his face pale as he caught sight of the tension that had suddenly descended upon us. There was no escaping this now. He must have known too. The guilt was written all over his face, his body language stiff and defensive. He stepped forward, his hand slightly raised in an attempt to defuse the situation, but Michael wasn't having any of it. "How long?" Michael demanded, his voice rising now, thick with emotion. "How long has this been going on?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I explain? How could I make him understand that this wasn't just about the affair, that it was about something deeper, something I couldn't even begin to articulate? But the truth was that I had no excuse. There was no justification for what I had done. I had betrayed him in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend, and the look on his face told me that he was processing that betrayal in real time, struggling to make sense of it. And as the seconds dragged on, I realized that there was nothing I could say that would fix this. The damage had already been done. Michael's gaze flicked to Dr. Samuel once more, his eyes narrowing with fury. "You knew," he said, his voice colder now, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You knew she was married, and you still did this." Dr. Samuel flinched, his face growing even paler. His usual calm composure had evaporated, leaving him looking more like a man who had been caught in a storm he couldn't control. "I never meant for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But Michael wasn't listening anymore. His attention was fully on me now, his anger directed squarely at the woman who had once been his wife. "How could you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with hurt. "How could you betray me like this?" I wanted to respond, wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? How could I make him understand that this wasn't about him? That I wasn't trying to hurt him? That this wasn't a reflection of how I felt about him, but rather a reflection of my own inner turmoil? But there was no way to explain that, not without sounding like I was making excuses. The truth was too ugly, too raw to be explained away with words. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as Michael's anger turned inward. He stepped back, his hand pressed to his forehead as if trying to hold himself together. The weight of the moment hung over us, and I could see his face contorting with pain. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he whispered, his voice breaking. The words were like a knife to my chest, sharper than anything I had ever felt before. And then the inevitable happened. "I can't do this anymore," Michael said, his voice hardening as he turned toward the barn door. "I'm done." His words echoed in the silent barn, and with them, my entire world seemed to crumble. There was no more pretending, no more lies. Michael's trust in me was gone, and with it, the fragile foundation of our marriage. I watched him leave, his figure disappearing into the distance as he walked away from me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt completely, utterly alone. The guilt, the shame, the regret, they all crashed over me in a wave, and I was left standing there, unable to move, unable to say anything. Dr. Samuel remained silent, standing off to the side as if unsure of how to proceed. But I didn't need him. I didn't need anyone. I had destroyed my marriage, and no amount of apologies or explanations could ever undo the damage. The truth was out now, and I had no choice but to face the consequences of my actions. The days that followed Michael's departure were a blur, like a hazy dream I couldn't wake up from. Every corner of the house felt foreign, every surface sharp with the absence of the man who had once been my partner. I was living in the aftermath of my own choices, and the weight of those choices bore down on me with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, wrapping itself around my chest until breathing became a conscious effort, each inhale a painful reminder of what I had lost. I couldn't sleep. The nights were long and cruel, filled with a silence that had once been comforting but now felt oppressive. The bed that I had once shared with Michael, the place where we had laughed and loved, felt cold and empty. I could feel his absence in every thread of the sheets, in the space beside me where he used to lie. And every time I closed my eyes, the images of our last confrontation flashed behind my eyelids, his face twisted with hurt and betrayal, his words cutting into me like shards of glass. "I don't even know who you are anymore," the words reverberated in my mind, a constant refrain, and each time they repeated, they felt like a new wound, reopening the old one, digging deeper into the raw, exposed parts of me. I had been so certain that what I was doing was right. At least that's what I told myself every time I saw Dr. Samuel. Every time I left Michael to drive to the clinic. Every time I lied about where I was going. I told myself that I was living for me, for my own happiness, that I deserved to feel alive again. But now, in the quiet of the empty house, those rationalizations seemed hollow, meaningless. The truth was undeniable. I had destroyed the one thing in my life that had truly mattered. The regret was suffocating. It wasn't just the affair itself, the betrayal of Michael's trust, or the knowledge that I had broken the vows we had made to each other. It was everything that had led up to it, the years of neglect, the quiet disintegration of our marriage, the distance that had grown between us without either of us acknowledging it until it was too late. And then, of course, there was the way I had deluded myself into thinking that an affair would fill the emptiness, would somehow make everything better. It had been an escape, a fleeting moment of something real, something passionate. But it had never been enough to fill the void inside me. The house felt even quieter when I woke up each morning, the hum of life outside fading into the background as I stumbled through my days, going through the motions of living but never really engaging with the world around me. I ate, I went to work, I did everything I was supposed to do, but it all felt meaningless, empty. The days blurred together in a way that made it hard to distinguish one from the next. I was floating, untethered, unable to grasp onto anything solid. Everything I had once known, everything I had once cared about, seemed like a distant memory, a version of my life that no longer existed. I had tried to call Michael a few times, but the phone calls went unanswered. I left messages, apologies, pleas for understanding, promises that I would do anything to make things right. But I knew, deep down, that nothing I could say would change what had happened. The damage had been done, and now it was just a matter of waiting for the inevitable fallout. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and no amount of regret could undo the hurt I had caused. I had no idea where Dr. Samuel was during all of this. We had stopped seeing each other after the confrontation, and I had no real desire to seek him out. He had been a distraction, a temporary escape, a balm for wounds I had ignored for far too long. But now I was left with the emptiness he had helped to create, and I didn't know what to do with it. My mind was a constant swirl of questions, each one more painful than the last. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let it go on for so long? Why hadn't I seen the cracks in my marriage before they had become a chasm? There were moments, fleeting moments, when I allowed myself to remember the good times, the laughter, the quiet evenings spent together, the plans we had made for the future. And those memories were what hurt the most. They were a reminder of everything I had thrown away, everything I had taken for granted. I had been so focused on the small, everyday annoyances, the things that seemed so important at the time. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, those things seemed so trivial. What had seemed like a distant, perfect life had been so fragile, so easily shattered. And I had shattered it. The loneliness settled in quickly. At first, it was the kind of loneliness that is shared by two people in a relationship, the kind that comes from unspoken words, from emotions that are left unaddressed. But now, in the silence of the empty house, it became something deeper. It wasn't just the absence of Michael, it was the absence of everything I had once thought I understood about myself. The sense of identity that had been built on the idea of being a wife, a partner, someone who mattered, was now gone, and in its place was a person I didn't recognize. Who was I now? What was I, now that everything I had once defined myself by had crumbled into dust? The truth was, I had never truly understood the weight of the commitment I had made to Michael. I had never fully grasped the depth of the promises I had made, the vows I had spoken, until now. It wasn't about love or passion, it was about trust, about a shared life, about building something together that could withstand the trials and tribulations that inevitably came with time. And I had failed him. I had failed us. In my desperation to feel alive again, I had forgotten what truly mattered. I had lost sight of the man who had stood by my side for so many years, who had been there for me in ways I had never fully appreciated until it was too late. As the days wore on, I began to see more clearly the way my actions had affected him. It wasn't just the affair itself, it was the betrayal of the trust we had built, the way I had neglected our connection, the way I had let the distance between us grow. I had treated him like he was a burden, like our relationship was a weight around my neck, when in reality it had been the one thing keeping me grounded. And now I had destroyed it. The regret became a constant companion, following me wherever I went, never letting me forget what I had done. I thought about Michael constantly, where he was, what he was doing, if he was hurting as much as I was. But the truth was, I had no idea. I didn't know if he still loved me, if there was any part of him that would ever want to repair what I had broken. All I knew was that I had taken something beautiful and destroyed it in the blink of an eye. And now I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered heart and try to make sense of the mess I had created. I couldn't turn back time. I couldn't undo the hurt I had caused. All I could do was face the consequences of my actions and try to make sense of the person I had become. And as the days passed, I began to understand the full weight of the regret that had settled into my bones. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about everything I had taken for granted, everything I had lost in my pursuit of fleeting happiness. And now, I was left to reckon with the consequences, to live with the fact that I had destroyed the one thing that had once meant everything to me.